Well, Professor Jack Lindsay, thank you very much for agreeing to share your expertise with us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I wonder if you could begin just by telling us a bit about your background, within the field.
Sure. So I joined a Masters of City Planning program in 1989, just before the San Francisco earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake. And that event made me really question how we do community planning in disaster-prone cities. And so that became the focus of my grad research. I worked with Dr. Neil Britton out of Australia. And then in 93, he and I both wound up working at Wellington City Council in New Zealand. I was their hazard analyst and planner. A few years later, I went to Auckland to run their emergency management office for the city of Auckland. And then eventually, beginning of 2000s, I came back to Manitoba, started up the Manitoba Health Disaster Management Office, did that for 5 or 6 years, and in 2005 came here to Brandon University full-time, and I've been teaching here ever since. This is an environment I feel really great in. It lets me continue to contribute to practice. It lets me teach, and it keeps me from being on call, which was, for me, I'm anxious reactive, which is great. Being risk averse and wanting to avoid disasters is great, unless you're on call all the time, in which case it can be very tiring. So I like teaching, and I like the way that our grads and grads from the York program and others are starting to really change emergency management from what it was when I started in 1990-ish.
Okay. And our program started almost the same time. I think you were ahead of us by 1 year, perhaps.
Yeah, 2001 was my first class. This is our 20th anniversary.
Okay. Oh, our first class were like 2005, so you're a few years ahead of us. Okay, well, the area I particularly wanted to talk to you about today is disaster movies, because I know you're very interested in that subject. You've been teaching a course on it for a long time. And I sometimes despair of winning the battle against the myths that just come through to the public in Hollywood disaster movies. So, where you try and get one message across, and then there are all these other messages that maybe are much more powerful. So I think it's really important for us to understand disaster movies, how they portray, these events and the people who try and manage them. So I look forward to hearing your comments on this.
Yeah, so I first became interested in disaster movie course when I was doing some work down in Texas with Dave McIntyre, and Dr. McIntyre taught a disaster film course at University of North Texas. Gave me the idea, we talked about it. There were 1 or 2 other profs around that had tried these kinds of courses. So we set it up. I'm trying to think, my first one was probably around 2014 or so. I think I've taught it 4 or 5 times now, alternate years. And I do it for, 3 I think main reasons. First is what you were just saying, that for most of the public will never really be in a large-scale disaster. They may be in some local community scale disasters, some flooding or something, but not necessarily the scale that of a Hurricane Katrina or even Hurricane Juan, or some of the events we've had in Canada. So people do look to the movies to get some, even if they're not going to with the intention of learning about disasters, they come away from the movie feeling like they've learned something. And so that's a concern, as you just said, that if the movies are perpetuating the myths about disaster, about the roles of organizations, about human behavior in disaster, then those myths can very much influence future decision-making by the public and really by the larger sort of government and other organizations. If that's what they're hearing, then those are the concerns that they're going to react to. If all of your citizens are scared about looting because they've seen looting in a disaster film, well, then your mayor is going to do something to prevent looting, even though when we look at disaster sites where there hasn't been any heavy security presence, we don't see looting. The looting that we see is often either driven by the circumstances, people seeking water or other necessities when they can't purchase them, or it's happening in communities that already have a great deal of social unrest, and it's really just an exacerbation of that underlying trouble. So for me, that's a message I want to get addressed. I want to make sure that students learn about that. And so my class is an open enrollment, no prerequisite. So I get about 100, between 80 and 100 students, which for BU is a very large class. It's small compared to what I know the big universities deal with, but our biggest lecture theater on campus holds 120. So we're pushing the limits with that class. A lot of students from education, physical education, the arts, and sciences, and my own ADA students take the class. And for the general student population, I'm really just trying to address those myths. Here's a movie, here are some things that it presents that are somewhat accurate, and here are some things that are presented that are highly inaccurate. And I hope that can carry on. The second purpose is for my ADA students, the Applied Disaster Emergency Studies students that are going to go on to practice in emergency management, because as practitioners, they need to know what those myths are, how the public is absorbing them, and how to counter them, not just from past disaster movies, but also when new disaster movies come out, right? So if we get, as we've been seeing, climate change driven movies, especially in the disaster B type movies that have the Atlantic conveyor belt stopping and plunging parts of countries into ice ages in minutes. If a new movie like that comes out, our practitioners need to understand, how am I going to deal with those questions? How am I going to turn this public interest driven by the movie into public action that's actually science-based and not fiction-based? And then finally, disaster management is a relatively new field, not one that is well recognized. We still don't have a separate designation within the National Occupations Code. There's dozens of types of fire chiefs, but there's not even sort of one type of emergency manager. So I want to make sure that a lot more students are exposed to the idea about disaster management and may decide that coming across to our program is a major or minor would be beneficial. And so in that way, it's a little bit of a trap that attract the students in with a topic that sounds interesting, and through that hope to engage some of them in our field. And again, that is I'm open about that. I don't hide the fact that offering courses that are attractive to students. Lots of disciplines have courses on connecting history to particularly exciting events, or building off of currently exciting television programs or other things. So BU has a number of courses that are similar, that may offer intro chemistry or intro geography, but without a lab or without as much academic focus, and more focus on understanding the discipline within a pragmatic or practical setting.
Yeah, I think that's fair game. You don't have to feel guilty about that.
Oh.
So in terms of disaster movies, what would you say the dominant themes are that you see being replicated in movie after movie after movie, which either is more or less realistic or unrealistic?
Well, there's certainly a few. I even have seen a T-shirt that says every disaster movie starts with politicians not listening to a scientist. And we very often see that plot device, whether the scientist is the lead character, like in Dante's Peak or in The Day After Tomorrow, where it's the scientist hero. Twister can be the same way. You'll get that scientist to explain the problem to a politician or a non-scientist as a way of exposing the audience to that knowledge, right? So in Twister, there's some discussion about the F1 to F5 tornado scales, so that the public can understand that if they're chasing a F4, that they're in trouble.
Yeah, I'm just going to inject a quick comment here. This whole idea about politicians not listening to scientists is echoing very strongly with me in terms of the COVID pandemic.
Certainly.
What's happening with a lot of the sort of the right-wing political parties in different countries.
Right. And so, we would hope that we would never see a politician that actually had the ability to carry out the idea of, say, detonating a nuclear weapon to disrupt a hurricane, the kind of thing that we might see in a movie, right? We need to drop an atomic bomb on the core of the earth to start the earth spinning again, or whatever it might be. It's more frightening to me when some of those kinds of ideas filter through to a higher level of government, or even get looked at in any sort of realistic way. So yeah, that science as a source of the problem, I think is an interesting issue as well. That the whether it's the natural hazards or the climate change related hazards, or even when you look at and there's actually peer-reviewed literature out there around things like Towering Inferno, the Poseidon Adventure, and the first of the airport movies in the early 70s, being a reaction to the public's concern or distrust of an engineering or technological solution to everything, right? That we can build a bigger building, we can build a bigger ship, we can build a bigger airplane, and it's all going to be fine. And the movies tend very much to separate that cause from the consequences and make all the victims seem disconnected from what they're involved in, right? Things happen to the victims rather than the victims being an integral part of the event unfolding. So I think that is one another theme that sort of runs through consistently. And then we see other problems. The timelines get compressed, right? The events have to unfold over the course of a 2-hour movie, and it might be that movie covers a day or a couple of days of movie time, but disasters don't start and stop in a day or two. The damaging effects of an earthquake might stop minutes after the shaking stops, but the impact on the community is going to be months and years, not hours and days. And I think disaster movies give a false sense of how disasters unfold over time as well, which can be a problem. It may set up an expectation in the public that that things are returning to normal quicker than we would expect based on the science.
Okay, so what about some other themes? Like I'm just thinking about many of the disaster movies that I've seen will really emphasize the lone hero figure. Arnold Schwarzenegger, anyway, some sort of hero who runs in and with his mighty physical prowess and moral high ground solves the problem. So is that a reasonable portrayal of a disaster movie theme?
Well, it certainly is a theme that we see most. You know, I'm trying to think of a disaster movie that is really an ensemble. I think Towering Inferno tried to approach that, but that was also new in cinema. You know, this idea that you could load a movie up with lots of big name stars. Towering Inferno had Paul Newman, and that's embarrassing to be blanking, Richard Chamberlain, and others. But to have a famous actor die, or the character die in a movie, wasn't common, right? So by doing that into the disaster film, it upped the ante. It made all the characters at risk. And that sort of big ensemble cast was, we saw it in Airport and to some extent in Earthquake. That sort of faded, and now you're right. We get Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or Pierce Bronson or whoever the current action hero is. They stick them in the role of scientist, or Tommy Lee Jones as emergency manager, or Dwight Johnson as rescue helicopter pilot who steals a helicopter and deserts his role and flies across California to rescue his daughter single-handedly from an earthquake and drives a boat over a tsunami. It just starts becoming fantasy, but it's still being portrayed as though these are realistic, real-life events that are occurring. I wish we could see a disaster movie that actually used the real and very valid tension and, if you will, excitement and risk that comes up during a disaster response. Sorry, David. Sorry, can you cut in YouTube videos?
I have to figure out how to do that.
We'll do some editing. Sorry. So in the movie Volcano, which is set, of course, in Los Angeles, a volcano erupting from the La Brea tar pits, and Tommy Lee Jones is the emergency manager, who out of reality, out of the norm, is seen all through the movie running around saving people, which is not what emergency managers do. But there are a few scenes set in their emergency management operations center with, I believe it's Don Cheadle as the emergency manager. And there's one scene where he walks into the room after one of the big earthquakes, takes a deep breath, looks at the screens and says something to the effect of, "Okay, folks, it's time for us to get to work." That one little line in a disaster movie probably sums up better what emergency managers do in terms of hazard and risk and impact assessment, and going through the processes of prioritizing demands and locating resources and everything else. The hanging off a helicopter to snatch people from the lava isn't the role of the emergency manager. So there's a little bit there as well, not just trying to defeat the myths about how disasters impact the community, but also properly frame the role of the emergency manager, of the hazard scientist, of the emergency services, and disaster movies do a bad job of that.
So earlier you referred to the looting myth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that looting never happens, but
No.
it tends to be, constrained to particular kinds of circumstances.
Yeah.
There have been some studies on to what degree even emergency managers believe in these myths. I was involved in one in Canada, and there's some older studies in the States that I've seen. I haven't seen recent ones. And actually, emergency managers didn't do too well in these myths. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the myths around how people behave, because this does represent sort of planning assumptions for plans, right?
So I think the two that, well, maybe there's more than two, maybe I can already say, I'm thinking of a third. There's this idea about looting that disasters come with an almost automatic breakdown of social norms, that that people will not just seek the resources they require, but they'll look to profit off of the event, either stealing from stores or looting or stealing from other victims. Again, something that we don't see an overwhelming amount of evidence for in real disasters, but is certainly played up because it's an exciting idea, and we get to expect certain tropes within movies, right? There are some things that we would expect in a Western, right? I mean, we expect Westerns to be dusty and to for the gunslinger to be jingly with his spurs and things. These are all just little clues to the audience that, hey, this is like those other Westerns you've seen. We do the same thing in the disaster movies, right? We put in certain images or certain scenes that help the public sort of orient themselves into what they're watching based on what they've seen before. And it's like, oh, this is comforting in a way because, this is looting, but I've seen looting happen in other disaster movies. So that makes this disaster movie as accurate as those ones were. So that, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that once myths get into the movies, that they are perpetuated into the future. And again, out into the public and into the media as well. The second one would be about the victim behavior. Often disaster movies portray victims other than the hero and the hero's immediate family or colleagues or the people that we're cheering for. Everybody else is portrayed as hopelessly unable to cope with their own problems, right? They are a helpless victim, entirely dependent on others to save them. And yet we know that in disasters, a lot of the first initial rescues are done by bystanders or others involved in the event. We know that the community coalesces and actually provides services that wouldn't normally be provided just at a community level or publicly. So it undermines that as well. It creates this sense that in a disaster, it's okay to be helpless and it's okay to wait for someone to help you rather than taking care of your own concerns and moving forward. And that echoes into then the whole panic myth that and we know within within this psychology that there are circumstances where a person has an extreme, threat to their life. They don't see a means of escape, where they may make almost seemingly blind or panic decisions. But it's a very unique set of circumstances, right? A parent driving the wrong direction on a road to get to the school to pick up their children isn't panicking. They're just not doing what the emergency managers have said in their plan that they would like parents to do. But they're doing what parents will do. They're trying to protect their children, right? So often the movies portray this idea that the public isn't listening. They're helpless. They need to be told what to do, but they aren't listening, and therefore they're panicking. That's a difficult one as well. I think we've all been in stressful situations where, in hindsight, we look back and say, I'm pretty sure I went through that red light getting my wife to the hospital during her labor, because you're so focused on the one task, but you're not panicking, right? You're just doing what you have to do.
I'm going to add just an interjection here. Media is horrible around this issue.
Yes.
For example, I remember seeing, that Italian cruise ship that sank a few years ago. What was it called again? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I remember seeing a video, and the video showed, and this is real time when it was happening, or near real time. So it showed a group of people lined up to go down a ladder into a boat. And the announcer was talking about the panic of these people. And I was looking at them. They were all lined up in a neat row, waiting their turn to get into the lifeboat. And I'm sure some of them were terribly afraid of what was going on, but there was nobody running around screaming aimlessly, going in different directions. There was no panic, at least from that shot that I could see. And yet it was discussed as, it was portrayed as panic by the media announcer, by the reporter. And so I see this as an issue, not just in movies, but in the media in general.
And it's that feedback loop that happens between the news media and the entertainment media, where they pick up on each other. I remember when the Northridge earthquake happened in California in '94, I was working in New Zealand, and so we were like 12 hours or so off the time zone of the earthquake. So I tuned in to watch, and it was 3 a.m. in the morning, about 25 hours, somewhere in that, because it happened overnight, the Sunday to Monday. So late in the Monday night, 3 a.m.-ish, and there's a reporter outside the Northridge sort of local city hall. And his words were, "It's eerily quiet here." It's 3 a.m. in the morning. The reason he's reporting the news of it being quiet is because what he expected was what the movies show us. Crowds of people running down the street with televisions, and police helicopters and rescue vehicles racing back and forth aimlessly. But by that time, in what was a serious but not catastrophic earthquake for California, also happened on a holiday, so they had some breathing room. But the message the media sends out is that if things are going well, that's the anomaly, not the other way around. They expect disasters to be panic-filled and chaotic, when in fact many disasters, even though they're overwhelming the community's ability to cope, the response to that is still fairly measured, or it's out of sight, right? It may be very quiet at a hospital that you have evacuated. It doesn't mean that it's not noisy somewhere else. It's just, if you're looking at the wrong thing, expecting to see a different image, and we see the movies perpetuating that as well.
So I've not infrequently seen in movies a general or a mayor or some authority figure saying something to the effect of, well, we can't tell them the truth or we'll create panic, and the panic would be worse than the disaster. To what extent do you think that that idea translates into on-the-ground emergency planning, and to what extent it is a problem?
Well, I think there's two sides. I think there is a legitimate side when, especially in regard to warnings or issuing alerts and things, where if you look at what the literature says, a good warning has to be part of a warning system, which includes all of the activities you would take to support the actions that you expect the public to take. So if we're going to warn the public of a tornado, then we also need to be prepared to have people sheltering in in hotels and things, maybe sheltering in internal hallways or other activities. And I understand why politicians and even emergency managers weigh the costs and liabilities of those actions against the costs or benefits of issuing a warning, especially when the certainty isn't there yet. We've seen, well, I suppose the New Madrid earthquake prediction, for those of the audience that are familiar with that event, where there was a false prediction of an earthquake on the New Madrid fault in the States that was picked up and given attention by the media. We knew that businesses closed early and there were economic impacts just from that false warning. So that is a concern, but I think the panic side of it is what we need to be addressing. I think that the politicians and the emergency managers in whatever decision-making role need to understand that issuing a warning or offering an evacuation order or all those other actions, they do come with consequences. But a good emergency management system is about managing those consequences, not just issuing the warning. And the movies don't do that either. If you think about The Day After Tomorrow, one of the Quaid boys is the scientist hero. And there's one scene where he just, in the front of the president and vice president, walks up to a map of the US, draws a Sharpie line across the center of the country in one swipe and says, everybody north of this line needs to evacuate. And I can only think of one other instance where a Sharpie has been used so inappropriately in a disaster setting. That is not how those kinds of decisions are made, by one person just arbitrarily drawing a line, and then not really doing any follow-up through the course of the movie about all of that meant. Like, what does it? It's easy to say let's evacuate the city in a movie, but the understanding the ramifications is difficult. Dante's Peak may actually come the closest to getting that right in some of the council meeting scene, in the public town meeting in the school gymnasium, where there is honest discussion, I think, about the pros and cons of evacuating based on differing scientific opinions about the hazard and whether or not the economic and reputational costs to the city that are guaranteed pretty much as soon as you order an evacuation, how do they weigh up against a threat, especially a threat that you may not necessarily perceive as real or not at the time. So these are the kinds of issues that I think the disaster movies allow me as an instructor to get into with the students. And as much as I'd love to talk about the decision to not order evacuation of New Orleans during Katrina, I don't have footage of the discussion in the EOC, but I have that in Dante's Peak. So it might give an opportunity for the students to have an example, good or bad, but an example to then pick apart. So I like that in the movies.
So there's a long list of disaster movies. Do you have any that you feel were particularly horrible? Not as a cinematic effort, but horrible from an emergency management perspective. And on the flip side, are there any that you thought did a pretty decent job?
Well, there's, first of all, I think there's definitely become a divide between the attempts at having a movie set in a disaster where, again, where the disaster plays a significant enough role that you would almost think of it as a character, right? And in the literature, you see references to, the Wizard of Oz starts with a tornado, but the Wizard of Oz is not a disaster movie, compared to Twister, where the tornado is actually, or the tornadoes, is an integral part of the developing plot. In those kinds of movies, the disaster movies, whether that's the recent ones like, well, Greenland, that's just come out with Gerard Butler talking about trying to escape from a impending meteor attack. I think that Full Impact also had some of the same sort of themes. So there are some big budget Hollywood movies that are better, but there is also now a subgenre of intentional B movie disaster movies by studios like Asylum that at their best or at their worst, depending on your viewing intention, would be like the Sharknado style events where the disaster is stretched almost to the point of parody, or actual parody movies like Airplane, where it is making fun of the genre. But if you take away those ones where physics experiments create electrical monsters, or any of those kinds of disaster movies that really fall into almost a science fiction or a fantasy, I think the ones that I like using in class for being worth watching, I think both Earthquake and The Towering Inferno from the early 70s have merit. I think Earthquake in particular has a lot of scenes that either portray a myth that's very easy to isolate and talk about, but there are also scenes in Earthquake where, for example, the off-duty police officer orders other residents who are standing around to check local homes, to go to the hardware store and get shovels and other equipment they could use. That's right out of Dines and Drabeck and others around, an emergent group, and using, somebody who is not acting on behalf of their emergency service, but is being acknowledged because of that role as a leader within the group. That's great. We can actually sometimes find things and say, this is probably not what the director meant to be this scene to be used for, but it's one that we can draw on. But the disaster movies went into a bit of a slump, and then we had the late 80s surge with computer graphics, and through the 90s, so Twister, Volcano, Dante's Peak. Those are ones that I also use, not because they're accurate, but again, they present enough clear displays of the myths, or enough scenes that have a root in reality that we can follow back to the actual truth, whether that's in the science of how different types of volcanoes erupt, or whether it's in the social science, about how people react, or whether it's in the emergency management around the role of an advisory agency like the U.S. Geological Survey, or versus a mayor versus a fire chief, right? So it might not be portrayed properly, but once it's portrayed, it gives us an opportunity to revisit those portrayals and talk about what is and was not accurate.
So yeah, this is such a great topic, and we could keep going for a long time. I guess the last question I ask you, bad as many of them are, do you enjoy watching them?
I do. I actually, I find watching the disaster movies easier, if you will, on my soul than watching real disaster coverage. I don't personally watch a lot of real disaster documentaries and things, because I perhaps like the escapism that the disaster movie allows me to sit back and know that this isn't really bad decision-making killing people. Whereas when you watch the documentaries, it's a bit more heartrending.
It can be pretty brutal.
Yeah. I will say too that it's really important, and this is something I talk about in my class, is to contextualize the movie you're watching in the time that the movie is being made. So if you go back and watch in old Chicago about the Chicago fire, or even perhaps more so San Francisco, two movies that came out during the Depression. Both of them have musical components. Both of them had big stars at the time. And both of them end with very uplifting scenes of, and we will overcome and we will rebuild, which is very much what the message was towards the end of the Depression. That this has happened, but we will move forward. And I think the next, another one to think about then is what happened to disaster movies after September 11th. And I talk in my class, and we often watch the last movie being often World War Z, the zombie movie, because I really am interested in how zombies and the portrayal of the whole zombie issue sort of took off again after September 11th. And I questioned at that time if it was because the idea that the terrorists could have been your neighbors, as the 9/11 terrorists were in the US, they were taking courses and they were living. And then as we went through SARS and some of the pandemics, the idea that the zombies were sick and it was your neighbor getting sick that was going to hurt you. I wonder if we are substituting the zombie for that that fear that we won't know what's going on and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, or that it could even be our friends or our family that are the problem. And I think we need to tease that apart. And I will say that sort of wrap up, as we do in the middle of this global pandemic, that Contagion certainly shows how a disaster movie can be made with the integral support of the agencies involved in that particular hazard. The CDC worked with the producers, and there are plot lines. The plot line about the CDC director telling his family about the impending evacuation echoes back to a real event within the CDC, where family members were notified before the public, and that had ramifications within the CDC. And so I like that movie, certainly one that I show. The Impossible, The Wave and The Quake, the two Swedish movies. There are some good disaster movies. Virus, which is an Indian movie about Nipah virus, that are fairly accurate portrayals of how disasters unfold. And for the most part, if you know those movies, they're movies that while they've got leading actors and actresses and characters, are not about one person doing everything, which, as you said earlier, is sort of a common misrepresentation in the disaster films.
Anyway, I want to thank you again for this interesting talk, and I'm sure our students are going to get a lot out of it, and we'll talk about a lot more in our classes too. Thanks again, Jack.
Great, thanks very much.